the Office of the Vice President for Academic Affairs and the Department of Language and Literature, once again, for supporting this series. Before we hear from tonight's guest, I'd also like to make a quick plug for the final event of the semester, which will take place right here in the same room on Friday, November 9th at 7 p.m. with the writer B.J. Hollers. So please join us for that if you can. This evening, we're delighted to be joined by Peter Coviello. Peter is a professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago. In 2017-2018, he was on fellowship at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. He specializes in American literature and queer theory. His research considers the entangled histories of empire and intimacy in 19th century America, with particular attention to questions of secularism, biopolitics, and sex. He's the author of 3 books: Intimacy in America, Dreams of Affiliation in Antebellum Literature; Tomorrow's Parties, Sex and the Untimely in 19th Century America; and the book he will be reading from tonight, Long Players, A Love Story in 18 Songs. After Peter reads for a bit, we'll open it up to questions and discussion. And then after that, Peter has some copies of his book. If you're interested in purchasing one, just stick around. I'm sure he'd be happy to sign one for you. And with that, please welcome Peter Coviello to the University of Dubuque.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm sort of honored and delighted to be here, and I'm very grateful to you for coming on. It's like an outrageously beautiful day. So thank you very much. Yes, it's true, I'm going to be reading from this book. I'm not going to read from any of the theory books, as pleasurable as that might be as a way to spend the next half hour. I'm going to read from this. So I should tell you just a little bit about the book, and I'll read a couple passages, and then that'll be that. So it's a book about a youngish man who, when we meet him at the beginning of the book, he's married, and he's moved to this new place, and he's fallen in love with somebody. He's very happy. He's trying to figure out how to be like a stepfather. He has these 2 very little girls, and then abruptly, suddenly that marriage implodes, and he spends the next 2/3 of the book like haphazardly trying to reattach himself to the world, kind of failing mostly, like mostly dumb efforts at doing so, involve a lot of bars and a lot of jukeboxes and that sort of thing, and also trying to figure out how to make his way in the life of these 2 little girls who are, now he's their ex-step-parent. So that person, I should say, is me, is the person that the narrator is actually me. And yeah, I should say it's like think of it as like a funny-ish book about an unfunny time was what I was hoping for, but we'll see. I'm going to read just a couple passages from the book, and then we could talk more about it. It's obviously a lot about pop songs, as about the best thing that the world has going for it. So this is from the beginning of the book. Things start out pretty happy. Spoiler. Yeah, so this is from chapter 1, and it's called "Be Still for a Second." And this is how the story proper begins. So on the way to what would prove to be the last of these, driving with Evany up the coast of Maine toward an anniversary getaway, I found myself crying. This was not unusual. I had spent by then nearly 2 decades shedding sudden tears over pop songs. In my 20s, in the isolation of graduate school, this happened most often in the shower. I'd have some rusted-out boombox perched on a towel rack and be listening for the 4th or 8th or 18th time to a mixtape, hoping in this way to steel myself against the unforeseen inanities of the academic day. And then some track would come abruptly to life, deliver its quick little knife to the heart. Maybe I'd be missing someone. Maybe the key change in a Jawbreaker song would unlock from its chamber some minor, unforgotten sorrow. Or maybe the inclusion of a Cheap Trick song, or of Going to California, or of Theodore Rutke reading A Rouse for Stevens would set off a micro burst of happiness, reminding me of the nearness to my life, even of people no longer close by. And so I would find myself half shampooed, one eye asquint with the sting of soap, enjoying a brief surrender to tearfulness. I will not lie to you and say that this ritual diminished much in frequency as the waters of adulthood began more and more to rise around me. In the shower, on subways, and most especially in the car, the private theater of emotional extravagance that is the car. These strange visitations continued. I had no objection to them. Even at my most sedate, I have always tended toward what you might call an effusiveness that, at least in the metrics of the waspy New England where I came to reside, was forever being read back to me as something between extravagant and alarming. How surprising was it that a certain vulgar loudness, which I preferred to call enthusiasm. It's great coming back to the Midwest, I would just want to say. Like, I lived in New England for a long time. I grew up in New England, and then I moved to Maine. And like, I was the loudest person in every room I went in Maine. You know what I mean? I was shushed at any number of restaurants. Anyway, sorry. It's true in the anyway. How surprising was it that a certain vulgar loudness, which I preferred and still prefer to call enthusiasm, would have as its counterpart an easy susceptibility to watery eyes, a hitch in the breath. The way I looked at it, Freud was right. People were, in the tumult of their emotional lives, far, far too much for themselves. There would always be more entailed in being a person, more conflict, more fear, more desire, more joy, more sorrow than you could ever quite wrestle into stasis or unruffled serenity. Because of what being a person is, conflictual, overabundant, you would always be in some real senses a kind of mystery, even to yourself. So if pop songs manage to open this little space inside you where you might actually stand for a moment in the presence of some of your more occult and turbulent emotions without being just pulverized by them, then God bless pop songs, was my feeling. As a mode of contact between you and your sharper conflicts, your impermissible excesses, you could do a lot worse. So my mistiness, that early morning in the high flower of midsummer, was really just a part of the texture of things. We were listening to the anniversary mix I'd made for her. Yes, I had made her an anniversary mix. I was quite entirely that person. And we had come to a song that all of a sudden seemed to distill into shimmering clarity the whole atmosphere of our busy, besotted, married people happiness. I can remember looking across at her as I drove, at her smile, and her legs bared for summer, and in an unsteadied voice saying something like, I want this to go much, much slower. That song was called Apartment Story. It was from a record called Boxer, and it was by a band called The National. So as I say, things don't go well after a while. But before that, there's still more. I want to read a little bit, because this is sort of about college. And so I want to read this. This is about being engaged. You know, I got engaged, and I was a young man, and people were like, really, dude, you? You're going to have stepchildren? I was like, yeah. Yeah. So this is what this is about. And yet, despite the long engagement, there truly was something rapid and impetuous about it all that gave these long months of engagement the feeling of being swept downstream. If you'd known the person I was only a few years before, you would not have seen many paths leading to this, the very most conventional of outcomes. I wasn't so much unconventional as unlikely, and from the looks of me, maybe a little militantly so. Here is a sheaf of photographs. Observe the guy on the left of that trio of boys outside a Chicago bar, with the stringy hair falling in limp curls down to his shoulders and not quite distracting you from the disaster of his goatee. The one with the yellowing "We Can Do It" t-shirt and the oversized jeans torn open at both knees, as if for ventilation. Him. He will not sell you drugs, this young man, though he will regard you politely when you ask, since, looking as he looks, he is used to it. There he stands, offering every last stylistic tick you might have hated about the 90s, gathered in one place for ease of consumption. You could be, yeah, I did look like, you look at me now, it's like a poster of, wow, the 90s were kind of terrible, right? Yeah, but they weren't, just PS young people, they were great. You could be forgiven for looking at that person and thinking something other than, yeah, let's give him a couple of little girls to raise. Marriage is a noble daring. John Dryden said that sometime in the 17th century. And when I think of that line now, which is often, my mind appends to it immediately something my friend Jennifer likes to say, which is this: sex makes us stupid. It is a sentence for which there are a lot of human occasions. My own more Pollyanna-ish version says that the feeling of being love-struck, that cracked open exhilaration, can induce us to believe extravagant, unlikely, possibly counterfactual things about ourselves. Being in love with Ebony made me feel gorgeous and wise, superheroic, like the protagonist in every love song I had ever heard. Today I would put it like this: before you came into my life, I missed you, etc. I was not then much equipped to mistrust this richness of sensation, what Nico Case, in a song of which I would come to be very fond indeed, calls that teenaged feeling. It seemed to me true north, the realest possible thing, a beacon to steer toward whatever the surrounding seas. But the truth is, I was not so altogether unprepared as you might have thought, despite the mute eloquence of the story told by my closet full of ill-fitting flannel and unrepaired denim. Even that guy knew some things. My heart was not a long, blank page. Even then, I had some ballasting experience to draw on if I needed to persuade myself that what I was proposing to undertake, this new family, was, let's say, feasible and not some messy calamity waiting to unfold. I had practice, in loving things a lot, and in turning ungoverned ardor into habitable worlds. I'd been listening to records for a very long time. College, for me, was like coming over the ridgeline of adolescence and discovering in one long, exultant gulp of perception that I'd lived unknowingly for years in the outer suburbs of a glittering, Oz-like metropolis, except instead of witches and emeralds, there was French cinema and birth control. Some people get to school and discover politics or drugs or group sex or any of the other intoxicants of spirit you encounter once removed from parental stricture. Not me. I did the predictable things. I read with dumb astonishment a great many books, and I listened to an even greater number of records, and these I talked about with the florid intensity of undergraduate devotion. It is only barely not true that most of what I learned in school, I learned by listening to Van Morrison's Astral Weeks, more or less uninterruptedly, for 4 years. You misjudge me a lot if you think that's a complaint. I met a boy there early on called Mark, and he had a talent enviable and unfaltering for making theories. Pick any handful of objects frozen just then in the amber of your cultural consciousness: metal bands, Bonanza, the early poems of Hart Crane, Patsy Cline, didn't matter. Without overmuch effort, and following whatever the cascading stream of talk, he could extemporize a narrative linking them into this cracked kaleidoscopic cohesion. It would be fluent and fast and unserious, and for me, 18 and new to college and all but vibrating with happiness about being there, pretty fucking joyous to behold. He had an oversized concert t-shirt embossed with the cadaverous image of Robert Smith, in which he would sometimes sleep. I missed that Cure t-shirt, I have to say. It was he who first played me tapes of Lyle Lovett, Dinosaur Jr., Nancy Sinatra, Ornette Coleman, The Replacements. He'd read books by people with names like Rutke and Coover and Rukeyser, though he could talk as readily about Guns N' Roses' appetite for destruction with the offhand familiarity of accidental expertise. So you see, Alec, deadpan, Slash is a player of many moods. He was also about the least self-aggrandizing person you were likely to meet within the egotropic climates of collegiate sociability, and he made you feel when you were talking to him that whatever he said was somehow half your invention. A long time before I had words for it, I knew I loved him, and this, along with the decision that he was the funniest person I had ever met, is one of not many judgments I made in the late 80s that I stand by utterly. From the ages of 18 to 22, that passage of maximal male insufferability, we weren't much apart, and this was a blessing and a mercy. It's hard to imagine how much worse I would have otherwise been, though it is clear I would have been worse. What this meant was that we lived for a while among a set of theories on deep rotation. These included the theory that Clifford Brown was better than Miles Davis, the theory of the inevitable return of Madonna's repressed Italianness, the theory of Grace Kelly's entrance. None of them was finally a great deal other than stupid, by which I suppose I just mean clever insular, designed to do not much more than entertain each other and whoever was around. The greatest of these, the brightest star among lesser lights, was the theory of astral weeks. Like many of the other theories in vogue with us then, the theory of astral weeks followed a basic grammar. What you think of as one thing is actually something else. You might think of astral weeks as a collection of gorgeous songs, neither hippie folk nor psychedelia nor rock and roll, a record so extravagant and weird and of such enchanting unlikeliness you hardly knew what to call it. But you would be wrong. It was my friend's insistence that the secret of Astral Weeks was that it told, in fact, a sprawling, broken story. And once you recognized this, each song and then the album itself became a new thing, strange and dense, but also in a delectable way, explicable. The thing to do, if you were listening with this kind of Talmudic devotion, was to make sense of the story. It was college. It was talk like that. I assume that at some point you'll have made a similarly Baroque liturgy out of your love for some like object. Young people in particular excel in making rituals of their devotion, and I certainly was devoted to Astral Weeks. But I will say that in the midst of all that juvenile veneration, what struck me most forcefully was not the record's interfusion of, say, joy and grief. No, all my wonder was saved instead for the quantity of work just a few swift sentences properly placed could do. For quite a long time, I could have told you staggeringly little about what you might call the substance of Astral Weeks. Love it, though I would surely have said I did. The record was, for me, not much more than a radiant atmosphere, a wash of sound whose sum was this giddiness of spirit it produced in me. And that was fine. I won't say this felt inadequate or like a deficit of pleasure, because it did not. But once touched with the wand of just a handful of words, a crackpot narrative, a theory, the record found itself transformed into a different kind of thing, something alive with sex and love and the strange, mostly abstract sorrows of adulthood. And for years, that transformation was most of what I'd hear. You could play me a track and I'd be dropped back into that long ago moment when a friend that I loved wrote this piece of quasi-scriptural revelation back into the world for me and made it a thing we might talk back and forth about in words anybody could use. And I will tell you this, it was, for me, an estimable and ramifying joy. It occurred to me that you could set even this record's flights toward the mystic, its weird exhilarations, down amid the ordinariness of your day-lit life, and they would, in the exchange, shed not a bit of the glowing otherworldliness for which you fell in love with them in the first place. You could turn your experience of dumbstruck delight in a thing into something else, theories, words to trade, and it would lose nothing. It might, in fact, be said to gather into itself a new kind of density and brightness, something lit from within by the presence of other people and your love for them and theirs for you. This is what I meant when I would say, as I did years later as he stood beside me on my wedding day, that Mark had given me my first glimpse of what criticism could be and why you might want to make a life out of it. So, you see, I was not so catastrophically unprepared for life as I might have seemed. Supersized flannel and terrible goatee notwithstanding. By the time I found myself kneeling in a living room on the coast of Maine, these were songs I knew how to sing. All right, I'm going to read just a little bit. One other thing. I'm skipping all the, a lot of this book is just post-breakup misery, by which I mean a couple hundred pages of meandering around the earth, very, very mopey. I'm just kind of skipping all of those, you know. Let's see. I don't want to take up too much of your time. Yeah, we'll just do this really quick. This is about, so the narrator of the book is ejected from his life, and he goes goes to New York and goes to Chicago and goes to Europe, and he tries to make himself stick. And he's trying to figure out the whole time, what are other people for? You know, what is, what am I doing with other people? And so this is during a long sojourn in New York, about a year after this sort of cataclysmic break a year that has not gone extremely well for the narrator. But here they are in the summer. One thing I am certain people one thing I am certain people are for: going to rock shows. On a close, muggy night in August, I take my friends Heather and Steve to see a band called Los Campesinos at a downtown venue crowded with NYU students, venturesome suburbanites, and hipster kids in glorious array. Heather and Steve are down from Maine for a few stolen days. Their young kids are with relations, and I am determined to plunge them back into the high seas, if not of youth, then of youthfulness. This show is just the thing. I'd first heard Los Campesinos, this band of Brit kids playing hyperkinetic heartbreak rock, only a month before, when, in the midst of a wedding trip to California, I detoured north to see Mark, the same Mark, and we passed the obligatory hour in the record store. He'd said I'd like them, and sweet Jesus, was he right. Each song on the record ran a kind of foot race, with 20-something mopery forever chasing behind the jubilation, the bounding post-punk bliss that comes of turning it all into frazzling, chaotic noise. They are touring on a record whose show-stopping number is called "We Are Beautiful, We Are Doomed." They're like the Smiths, if you can imagine the Smiths tending at most every instant towards some euphoric, spazzy Ritalin high. And this is great, this is when they were like 23 on their first American tour. They're now like in their mid-30s still touring, and I love them very deeply. From the sweaty, swaying morass of the pit, I point out to Heather, the bass player, who is like the rest of the band, throwing herself into each of the numbers with jerky abandon, her hair up in a great swirling pile, but she is also just now beaming. She's wearing a grin almost impossibly open and wide, and though there is no mic in front of her and an avalanche of sound caving in from all directions, she is singing along. She mouths all the words and jumps around and smiles and just rocks completely the fuck out. Heather shouts in my ear that she's never seen a rock star so charming and so outlandishly sweet. They are fantastic, utterly winning, and they're reminding us what it's like to be sad and overjoyed all at once. It's like being a fan. Later, in the encore, they cover a Pavement song, and it occurs to us that the songs of our vibrant indie rock 20s are, for these beautiful, brilliant kids, throwbacks, influences, classics. But it doesn't matter. Like the middle-aged vampires, we have no choice but to be. We siphon off all the youthful elation and spin back out into the city, which offers plenty of room for it and us. There are sorrows still for me to get lost in, I know. If I've learned nothing else, it's that it takes one misfiring thought for everything to combust. But they do not find me tonight. Nor do they find me later, that tipsy and exhausted evening back in the dark of my borrowed apartment where, with Heather and Steve in the bedroom, I fidget and turn on the couch in the living room. Instead of sleep, instead of mournful visions of the girls, my now ex-stepdaughters, I find myself making a kind of insomniac litany out of the year, the impossible year, now trailing behind me. In this blurry accounting are bars and bedrooms and couches, concert halls and dance floors. There are bands and bands and bands. With little distinctness at first, it's so late and I'm so jangled, but then with something at least nudging toward clarity, I begin thinking, too, about songs. What, I wonder, have I not asked them to do? When thought buckled, they wrenched it out of its direst patterns. When the days turned dark, they shook the world out of its sense of airless impossibility. For 3 or 4 flashing moments, they somehow made it seem that even a world whose truest and least negotiable facts were bereavement and sorrow and loss might also be something luminous, unfinished, a scene of transformation. And when we needed to hold ourselves together, the girls and I, songs, fucking songs of all trivial things, made a place where all that had seemed to be voided between us, all the nameless aspects of our devotion to one another could find traction, presence, a way to be held to the spinning earth. I am buzzing and drunk and awake and happy to have Heather and Steve with me. I'm happy to be in a city so filled with reckless pleasures and friends I love, and I am thinking again of songs. I am thinking that whatever I might find myself impelled to say about them, at whatever pitch of vehemence or agitation, all I am saying is that they are a gift, a gift, a gift, a blessing from the fallen world. And here they were again, working their sweet confected magic, filling the days with something awfully close to joy. Thanks. That's a totally false version of the book. Nobody's weeping in that, yeah, and that's good.
All right, so any questions that you might have about what you heard or other things related to, writing, reading, literature? Go ahead and toss them up there.
Exactly, I'm ready.
What's your favorite band?
Dude. Yeah, I should have seen that coming, you know what I mean? I will say, just for the polemical sake of it, I keep saying Los Campesinos is the best living rock band. But that's ridiculous because we're in an age of overabundant pop genius. So just give it another week. I don't know, the Daughters of Indie Rock, as my friend Mark likes to call them, are sort of killing it in the world. Snail Mail is a great band. Anderson .Paak is fantastic. SZA's records, there's always, as I used to tell at the beginning of the book, I used to tell, a friend of mine was very sad, she had this breakup, a friend of mine knew when I was 22, and I was like, because she had a breakup, so she was sad. And she was older and smarter, and I was very stupid. And so what I said to her was I don't know, man, how can you be so sad? I mean, there's just always gonna be good bands. And as I say in the book, she loved me enough even then to be I'm gonna let that go. That's true. The world will keep getting worse and bands will keep getting better. What else can I tell you? On that cheerful note, anything else? Yeah.
You use a lot of denser language, not normally used in regular conversation. I found myself blinking let me try and process that.
Yeah.
I understand that you're well-educated and a writer by profession, but any reason you chose?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's sort of like I was telling the class I met with today, my goal in writing is always one thing: sound like me. Just sound like me. And this book, unlike my academic book sounds like me talking in a classroom. This book sounds like me talking in a bar. And I'm a sort of a prolix bar talker, you know what I mean? These are I've always had a lot of words. But I wanted to get it so you're totally right, the diction of the book, say, is not the super simplest diction in the world. At the same time, though, it's kind of what I sound like. You know what I mean? I swear a lot less in the book than in bar talk, or but yeah. That's okay. I wish I could have one more note, and I'd have been wait. No, I think that's a good question, though.
Do you want to expand a little bit on that about influences? You talked about some.
Oh yeah.
That influences.
Yeah, so most of the writing I've done I'm an academic. I write the books that you were telling me about before, books about the history of sexuality in 19th century America and stuff like that. But as you can tell, since I was 18, what did I most like being a critic about? It was fighting with people I loved about objects I loved, be they books or movies or songs or bands or whatever. And while I was doing that, I always had a part of me that wanted to be true to the kid who liked fighting about Clifford Brown. Be true to the kid who liked fighting about Jawbreaker. And and I started writing with these essays with my other hand, you know what I mean? It's a great time for small, non-huge form writing. So I was writing these essays, and they were all about music and my stepdaughters, or my then ex-stepdaughters, And I started doing this other thing. And I complicatedly got an agent, and I was maybe I'll write a book of essays. And he was no, don't do that. You know how to write essays. You're an academic, you know how to write essays. Do something you don't know how to do. I was it's tell me a whole big story. Tell me the whole thing as a whole story. And I was well, Jesus, now I got to think harder. And so I was reading a lot of other stuff. And there's a book some of you may have read named H is for Hawk by Helen MacDonald. And it's a grief memoir by a woman who trains a hawk. There, I've told you the story. Her father dies. She is paralyzed with grief about this, and she trains a hawk. my friends, I don't care about falconry. Like, I know nothing about hawks. And this book was just in a sentence-to-sentence way gripping. Just beautiful and gripping. I thought, like, that. I didn't want to write a book about, like, sorrow and weird family and joy and loving your friends that people who don't care about Jawbreaker or, like, punk rock bands from the 90s might be interested in, too. So that was, like, a big thing. Though, of course, I spent my life reading books by, like, Henry James. Like, I can't get Henry James's syntax out of my writing, and why would I try at this point? You know what I mean? Henry James, George Eliot, Middlemarch is one of the most beautiful books in the world. Thomas Pynchon, because he's so funny. So yeah, that'd be some of the influences. So I was going to say blame them for the way I talk like that. That's what I'm happy to say. Blame James. What else can I? Yes, sir.
So what was your inspiration for this book in particular?
This book in particular. Well, so this like, you know, I'm just an academic, you know, and this kind of like terrible thing happened to me. Not like it's just like, as I say in the book, is a divorce. You know what I mean? Like ordinary, unexceptional cataclysm. And I was trying to think like, what happened to me, you know? And I started writing these, like I say, writing these little essays. And it ended up being about, like, I thought I was writing about the Jackson 5. I was writing about my stepdaughters. I thought I was writing about Prince. I was writing about putting our life back together. And I wrote all these essays, you know, and they started to circulate. And like I said, I met this guy who was an agent. And I was like, let's do a book of essays. And he told me, like, I don't want you to do a book of essays. I want you to, like, do something it's a great advice. Do something you don't know how to do. Like, do something you don't, write a whole book that's not an academic book, that's in this different voice, and tell the story. And so I did. Sidebar, like, I wrote it, and I was like, so psyched, you know, I finished this book. I gave it to the agent, and he was like, this is great, thanks, it's awesome. It's all wrong. No, it's wrong. I love it though, but it's wrong. No, go back and do it again. Which was terrible. And the reason it was wrong is because the first draft was just all about, like, me being sad. And he said he said one of the best, most useful writer phrases I've ever heard, which is this: your sadness, it's just not that interesting. And I was sort of like, no, there's actually nothing more interesting. I don't know if you've heard that, but, you know. And that was great. And then I had to, like, do the work of rewriting it and figuring out, like, okay, what story is this? And he was right. It wasn't a story about how sad I was. It was a story about things that kept me attached to the world, which were the people I loved and these two girls and songs. So that's sort of how, you know, kind of why, put it this way, wanted to write 3 love letters at once. One to my friends, one to all the bands that kept me alive, and one to these, you know, little girls who are now grown-ups. That's I guess a long-winded answer to a straightforward question. Thank you. Yes, sir.
So as you talked about your book, you talk about it as your story, and then you talk about the speaker,
Yeah.
narrator. What's that about, that differentiation between you and the
Yeah, I
the
mean,
book?
it's a really good question. Part of what the book is finally about is, as I was telling the like wonderful young people I was talking to today, it's about a book about, like, reckoning with how bad you were at the things you really wanted to be good at. You know, I really, really, really wanted to love those girls and that family as best I could, and I was not good at it. For totally human reasons, no for malicious reasons, but, like, you know, that's really the story, like reckoning with a lot, or rather, the story is like, you watch this person reckon with a lot of shame, and he has to figure out which he earned and which he didn't. So that's part of why. You know, the moral of it, like, I give interviews about it. So what's the moral of the book? And well, like, the moral for me is do better. Like love people a little less narcissistically, et cetera. And what better cure for male narcissism than writing a memoir, really? You know, so that's I feel like I really figured that out. But yeah, I think that's why I've found myself. Also, I have no idea how to do this. You know what I mean? Like I'm an academic. Again, I would, like, usually stand up in front of people and be like, I'm going to tell you now about Joseph Smith and the history of sexuality in 19th century Mormonism. Go. And I could do that, but this is a different sort of thing, you know, and I'm still not quite at ease in it. But thank you. What else can I tell you? Yes, sir.
I usually think about the Institute for Advanced Studies with Physics and Einstein.
No, it's a fair point. And you're like, what were you doing there, man? Yeah, that's a fair. The Institute for Advanced Studies is a place I was on fellowship last year. It has a lot of scientists. It has a school of historical studies and a school of social science. And very weirdly, I was in the school of social science because one of the professors there is a woman named Joan Wallach Scott, who you may know. She's like a spectacular historian of gender and secularism. She works on secularism. She'd read some of my stuff. I was finishing this book about the Mormons, and she was like, okay, come there. But it was really like, it was pretty cool. It was like me and a couple of my friends and like 200 like physicists talking about black holes and things like that, you know? So that was a good time. I would hang out with the physicists and be like, you know, you guys want to know about polygamy? I can tell you about that. You know? Yeah. And it was especially weird that this book came out when I was there, because they were kind of like, all right, man, sure, I guess, God bless, you do you, you know? Yeah. Yeah. So that was pretty good. Yeah. Founded by Einstein. Einstein's all over the place. Yeah. Yeah. And then
Still in contact, like with the girls?
sure. Yeah. 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 They're. This is all 10 years ago. Yeah. So the book was a lot about like the labor of imagination it took to like keep that together. It's a little sidebar. I'll say like, so what you heard say what I do in my daily life is like queer theory, you know. And one of the things that was valuable to me about queer theory and is valuable to me about queer theory is just a reminder that, oh, there are far more kinds of love and social adhesion in the world than there are proper names for it. And like queer scenes, where I've had the like most sustaining parts of my life, specialize in improvising kinds of love outside the parameters of familiar proper names. And I can't tell you how valuable that was for me when I was no longer husband, father, stepfather. When I was something else, something that we had to make up, that we had to improvise. And that was, so that's where, so this is, you know what I mean? Like that's where the academic part of life in this book really coordinate. But thank you for that question. You were gonna ask something.
Yeah, I was gonna ask, so how did your overall passion come about for becoming a writer?
Oh, well, you know, is being like a kid and not being good at much else, you know? Like, I played in bands. Somebody asked me today if I played in bands, and I was like, yes, badly. I played in like, which is perfect. Like, if you like punk rock, it was great. It was ideal, you know? But I just, you know, and I liked, you know, I was a young person and I kind of like fell in swoony love with things like books and records, and I like talking about them, and that's how I knew the people that I loved. Like, that's how I made my friends, because we'd be fighting about things like, how can you possibly think that about, you know what I mean? And that was like, that's the thing that made me most happy, just wanting to stake a claim about the things I loved and why I did, and hear somebody else's and mix up my language with their language. And writing and teaching seemed like the best way to make a life out of that. Somebody probably a little more inventive and imaginative than I am would have thought of a different way to do it, but this is my roundabout sort of way to it, I guess. But it's mostly that, you know, like I was susceptible to falling in love with stupid things like pop songs and bands. And this seemed like a good way to like build a life around that. Yeah. Yeah.
How long were you married for?
How long was I married for? About 10 years. This is, the book covers about my late 20s. I like to think it was like my maximally enthusiastic and or stupid me into my late 30s. You know, so yeah. That's the book only covers about 18 months. Yeah, so it was weird. As I used to teach at this little college in Maine, you know, that's where this all happened. And like on Friday, like 6 days ago, I gave a reading there. That was intense. I was super nervous. And a friend of mine, you know, I have all these friends there, and he was like, "Of course you're nervous, man. It's where the bomb went off." And I thought that was pretty good. But they were, you know, that's where that all happened about 10 years ago. And since I moved to Chicago, and that's where my next life is taking place. Yeah.
Maybe one more question, if there's one out there.
And then it can release you into the gloaming. It's really beautiful out. Yeah. One more. No denunciations from the floor. It's always good to have a little denunciation from the floor. It's always rejuvenating. Yeah.
How have things gotten better?
How have things gotten better? I don't know, man. Like trying. I'll say this. I'm never been so happy to write. I guess that. But that's like a small, like my inclination is that they haven't at all in the world. Like the world is going in one direction rapidly, and that's terrible. So it's hard to be like happy. You know what I mean? I mean, I think a lot of people, it's hard to be happy. Though, which I mean, I feel really happy. I have a whole new life, and it's in a city that I love so much. Some of you know Chicago, i.e. greatest city on planet Earth. As I say in the book, even before I was moving there. So that's all very happy, and it's hard to figure out how to manage one's own happiness in the context of a world that does not seem to have room for everybody else's happiness, or the possibility for everybody else's happiness. Yeah, I know, I keep landing on grim things. Anyway, with that, I'll just say thank you very much. Make your way to Chicago if you can. This is a delight. Thank you.